welcome to the Unreleased, the Design Research Podcast. This podcast exists to help map, broadcast, and promote design research worldwide. The Unreleased podcast is brought to you by IADE, Universidade Europeia, and UNIDCOM. To know more, visit unreleased.unidcom-IADE.pt. That's .unidcom-IADE.pt. In this interview, Rodrigo Hernández-Ramírez talks to Juan de la Rosa, a design researcher and educator at the University of Illinois, focusing on participatory design and community engagement. His work explores collaborative processes for shaping public infrastructure and embedding values into design outcomes. He has led projects in Colombia that integrate social innovation and co-creation with local communities. Juan also advocates for inclusive research practices and the recognition of non-traditional outputs in design academia. In this episode, Juan de la Rosa discusses his participatory design research focused on community engagement and public infrastructure. He reflects on the challenges of co-design, the role of values in design objects, and the importance of building trust across cultural contexts. Juan shares insights from projects in Colombia and explores how teaching and research inform each other. The conversation also touches on language, colonialism, and the evolving nature of design research outputs. Here is Rodrigo Hernández-Ramírez and Juan de la Rosa.
Welcome, Juan de la Rosa, from University of Illinois. First of all, thank you for joining us in Unreleased Design Research Podcast. What are the themes and topics that you normally do your research on?
It's been a path. I think for me, when I started doing research, I was more concerned about design methods and design methodologies. As I have moved through design research, I think that it's becoming more of understanding how do I collaborate and facilitate the process of building stuff. So the process, usually I work with communities on determining their needs or their intentions for the future.
So it's about, you were telling me about, it's more about collaboration, more about working with communities. So you do a lot of community work?
Yeah, so a lot of what we do right now, or a lot of, and I say we, and because it's like when you're working with communities, then they become part of like your research team in a sense. The knowledge that you produce is a knowledge that it's a collaborative, collective knowledge. And yes, I do work a lot with communities that are trying to define ways in which they can create public infrastructure, or they can participate in the process of designing public infrastructure and determining what they need for the future.
So you were talking about like working, not co-designing necessarily, but...
Yeah, I think that one of the perhaps the misconception of co-designing is that you got to have everyone involved in every single process of designing something. And I think that there's qualities, capacities, and training that would make a specific person ideal for part of a process, at least for guiding and collaborating one part of a process. And I think that participatory design and co-design should encourage the knowledge of each one of the participants in a specific way. And we all share, but at the end, there has to be some specifics that everyone collaborates on. So a lot of what I do is I get communities involved, decision makers involved, policymakers involved, people from the government, from institutions, from education, from the community, in a process where we discuss alternatives for the future. And then based on those alternatives, like we map values and ideas of what they want as a community for the future. I think there is a process that is more of a deliberative process of understanding that future as something that they create collectively, and they have to be aware of the intentions and needs of each one of those sectors. And as they deliberate, they come up with the structure not necessarily the final object, but the structure and sense of that object that they're designing.
Kind of pathway,
Yes.
initial pathway. Okay, that it's subject to change, obviously, given
Yeah.
the conditions. Okay, so it's not having the person involved. It's not like a clean client that is always there and that you always have to do, because that is usually the resistance in the industry or in places that are not used to participatory design. They see it as this more of a drag or a weight than something that actually helps something better to emerge.
Sure.
Okay.
And I think that co-designing should help in the process of building capacities inside a community or a group. But I don't think that those are, so we were having this conversation earlier with someone of like whether or not it's about teaching design methods or building capacities. And I think it's about building capacities because there's people who can get involved that are designers and they can help in the process of finishing or configuring objects, images, elements, buildings, whatever. I think that the building capacities is how much are you integrated in the process, how much you participate on actually making sense of what the future is, rather than the physical action of producing that future.
You talk about teaching. So which area or themes, I mean, we already talked about participatory design, but how does your own work, your own research inform your teaching? How do you see it? Do you see it as something that it's kind of a synergy, the one informs the other, or do you treat them as a separate thing?
That's a good question. I think that there's a tension there because most organizations, most schools, institutions, there's a tension on trying to sustain a certain notion of what design is. And so like a conservative view of what design is and should be. And there's also the tension of new knowledge being created and incorporated into the ideas that we have to have. And that is normal in academia. It's like we are the saviors and protectors of the knowledge that already exists, but we're also supposed to produce new knowledge. So I think that there's always a tension in there. I try to incorporate my research always in the way that I teach, at least either with notions or concepts or with complete themes and classes that address stuff like, so right now I'm doing a lot of like values embedded into objects because that's part of what I do on my research is understanding that the objects that you produce are embedded with values and you can either decode or code those values into the objects that you're designing or into something that is being designed by somebody else's. So I think that informs constantly the way that I teach or what I teach, but there's always a tension. And you feel it talking to scholars on how like they want to bring more of that research into the classroom. And it's harder if it's undergrad. If it's grad students, it's a little bit easier because it can be more flexible. If it's undergrad, it's like, should they learn to do research since they're like in undergrad? I believe so, but not everyone feels the same.
And also the commitment of what is it that we are understanding by research, and also
Exactly.
the very definition, the problem that you pointed out, that a definition of or an approach to research is necessarily entailed to a definition of design. What type of design? What do we understand by design?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's like whether or not you're researching for design and you're doing a lot of like, background research and, ethnography, that is great. You have to. But then there's the other side that is like, how do you incorporate that into the knowledge of design? How do you create new knowledge? How do you use different techniques of research for design, not just for design, but in design and through design, right?
Yeah.
And that is a little more complicated.
You mentioned that you try to teach your students or bring into the classroom a notion of values embedded into objects. And I mean, personally, that's a thing that interests me. How do you go about helping them to unpack those values? Like how to understand the like literally, I'm using the metaphor of like opening up the object and seeing everything that went into it. What would be one of the methods that you use to that?
So we do different things depending on the level of the student. So when first year students, we do a lot of like visual analysis. So we observe both visual objects like images or physical objects, and we try to decode certain things like what does it work for, how does it work for, who is involved in the process, who's not involved in the process, what are the visual elements that you can see in it, what is the narrative behind the object, and that is specifically significant in images. So recognizing that the image actually represents a specific narrative and a voice is something that they do, and they have to decode that and understand it and bring it into it's not just decoding. I think it is becoming more aware of that narrative, what it means, and how there was someone who wasn't part of a process, usually a designer or an artist, a graphic artist, that took that narrative and incorporated it into the object, the image that he was creating.
Okay, it's kind of interesting. Do you use any sort of ethical framework to guide that, or it's just discussion, open discussion? And
Usually it's open discussion, but then they have to find the ethical framework to bring it up, and then that becomes part of the process, right? Like understanding that ethics is something also that is constructed, right? And then we have to unpack it too, and it could be debatable, right?
do you have any project project that you would consider like exemplar of the kind of work that you're doing, research?
So I use one of my projects a lot as a couple of projects also actually as a reference of what I do. One of them was related to they're both related to infrastructure. One of them was with a community that was working with recycling in Colombia, and it was a community that they work with collecting garbage from the garbage landfill, right?
Okay.
And they were having this. We were doing a design thinking workshop with the community, with a larger community. They came into the community, and the way that it was framed by the people who like managed the workshop was that they needed local playground for the kids. So the whole process was like, how do we build, like self-reflect and build a playground for the kids? But I was interested on like unpacking more of that, on the values, issues, concerns that they have as a community. So I went farther and stayed for a couple of extra days, and we did this workshop on unveiling certain things through objects. So we created objects, narratives, and we started unpacking what was on those narratives and things. And we found interesting things, even like them as a community and me as a researcher found different things. So for example, one of the things that we found is that they, through this systemic mapping, that the issue with the kids is not something that was solvable with the playground, because the issue that they have is that the kids would follow the trucks of garbage into the landfill to collect things. And it became sort of like a game for the kids, like a treasure hunt. But the thing is that playing on the playground was not going to solve that, because as soon as they see the truck, there's the new...
Yeah, it's a pattern that already
exactly. Exists. So we started like reflecting and creating a pathway for them as a community to start working on the idea of playgrounds as something that they wanted to incorporate. The process of changing the idea of them becoming just unpacking or collecting garbage, but they becoming responsible of processing that garbage or creating a place where they can process that into something that can be used for playgrounds. And then changing the role and the benefit and the gain of the kids, of the scavenging, into something that was more...
Giving it a purpose.
Exactly, and more forefront. Like, we are going to change the role of the kid, instead of being in the back end of the process, being in the front end as a ecological guide in schools and stuff like that, and they can still make money out of it, or create some value out of it, but in a different part of the process.
So rather than trying to impose a structure on an already complex situation, trying to take the advantage and the elements in which that situation could be turned into a way in. Okay, that sounds really, really interesting. Do you normally work outside or in Colombia, or do you work also in the United States? Or where's your field work?
A lot of my work is in Colombia because there's a lot of stuff that can be done, and I think that's when we're talking about like challenges and opportunities. I think that there's always challenges and opportunities in everything. Every society has issues that we have to solve. But there's certain places where you can see that there's more urgency on finding a way out of something that is in between the colonialist view of what they should be doing, the indigenous way of doing things, and a path out of that future that is prescripted into something that is more deliberated by them as a society.
I'm asking because, I mean, yeah, that you mentioned the word difficulty. Obviously, you're Colombian, so you're from the context, you understand the context, and it's not quite the same as someone, an American or European, going to another context, like talking or referencing Paul Heckert's keynote early on, where a mixed team of Dutch people working with people from India and developing this new school. It still has kind of like this feel of kind of sounds like an imposition, even though it's not necessarily ill-intended. I'm talking about this because also in Australia there's this huge tension where you see a lot of universities that actually, or researchers that actually want to work in communities, but it's at the same time so regulated, and necessarily there's a lot of distrust from these communities towards the Europeans, and it's a constant tension that it's, I mean, a similar place would be certain places in the United States where there's this tension that it still exists, and of course Australians have been a little bit better at managing that. Do you feel that your capacity as someone who understands the context allows you to, gives you a broader perspective, and like if you were to give advice to someone who's an outsider in this case, what would you tell them to engage these people who really want to go and like do it with respect, or do it with understanding and managing, or managing is a bad word, negotiating this distance or this chasm?
Sure. And I think that is more complicated with like we have underlying realities, right? So colonialism is a reality, and we cannot ask someone who is sadly, like if you're a white European researcher, it's going to be harder for you because you will, no matter how you fall, you're going to fall a little bit like the white savior, right? And it's complicated, and it's a matter of like building trust and being open. And I think that communities are not necessarily close to accepting you as long as you enter. And I love one of the presentations in this event that is not about like accepting the truth of someone. It's more about setting yourself in the state that you value the truth of someone as in the same level that you value your own truth. So it's not about becoming one. It's not about like being sort of like there's a word for it.
It's like Gestaltung or
No.
Umwelt?
No.
I try to find a German.
Yeah, no. But I'm thinking about like how like certain people feel like in order to get an agreement, you have to basically like surrender yourself and become one. And I don't think that it's about that. I think that the issue is more about accepting the other in the same state.
Consonants or
Exactly.
Yeah, there's a word in Spanish, and I know which one you're looking for. It.
But I think that if you really want to go and work with communities, regardless if you're working, if me as a Colombian, I'm working in the U.S., or me as a Colombian, I'm working in Colombia. If I go to a community and I go and like, I'm still an outsider, of course. Yeah. And even though there's no like maybe a difference in race, there's a different in language. But there's a difference in the way that we use language.
Yeah.
It might be the same language, but there's a difference in the way that we use it. There's a difference in education. There's a difference probably in social status, because you're a scholar from a university and their community. So I think that as being open to like learn from the other people and stating that as you go through, like, I'm not bringing the truth, I'm not bringing solutions. I'm here to learn, I'm here to share, and I'm here to facilitate that process in between us into something that might be favorable for everyone.
There's this practice, original practice called the yearning circle in Australia, where people just sit around, and it's a very important cultural artifact process. And I remember with some of our Aboriginal staff members, we kind of try to establish this dialogue. And for example, one of the issues, even though Australia has the non-traditional research outputs, which are not like everything that is not a paper or a conference paper or journal or anything like that. So it has a kind of space. But often, because you have a grant and you have to show some sort of output, it's very difficult to get something that is recognized within academia, that kind of work with communities, because it takes so long because of the way of all the processes that are necessary for genuinely working with a community. And one of our colleagues mentioned, it's just that what we have to change is the notion of what is it that we're considering an output or a solution, which is, it is not a thing in itself. It's the relationship that you build between the designer, in this case, and the community itself. That is the output that you're trying to do. That is the bridge. And I found a really interesting way of challenging it, and a like complete reversal of what we understand, because we normally think of it as a kind of like a thing made, but it's something that is so intangible and yet so powerful.
No. It's a really good example. One of the things that is happening right now in the University of Illinois is that they're pushing into something that they call PERO, that is Public Engagement Research Option. And the idea is that if you're working as a researcher whose job is engaging with the public, and the output is usually, it could be a lot of things. It could be a workshop, it could be a white paper, it could be a policy proposal, it could be a document with the community. And then they're saying like, okay, we want you to be part of this, and we want you to start developing ways in which we can understand objects that are still outputs of knowledge that we produce by working with communities, and not being judged by academics, but being judged by the community.
Okay.
So communities seeing the work that you do and saying this is something that is valuable. And I think that that's a really interesting notion that is still in the process of being created, but I think that it's a good notion for design. I mean, we sometimes work in processes that are like 2, 3, 5 years, and we cannot have like a paper maybe to report. Maybe we do, but maybe there's a lot of stuff that is happening there that is constantly evolving.
Documented in the
that is
same way.
not exactly.
Okay. Yeah, that's the same issue. Is how do I document this? And often the grant finishes, and I cannot.
Yeah. How do you prove that you were doing job?
How do you prove? It's not a matter of that, but in the end, it has to be.
And you have to recognize that the times are different.
Yes.
So for example, when you're doing an experiment, a control experiment, and it might take you like a couple of months to set something up and organize it and run the experiment, and then do a second round of experiment to control, and then, variables and stuff like that. But it's something that in a year you can publish 4 or 5 papers of experiments that you have done. In design research, especially working with communities, it could be something that it takes you just 6 months to get in touch with the community and build trust with the community, so you can start doing something. And then it takes you like, weeks of like preparing, like who's going to be as part of a workshop, do they have the time, how can we find the resources, blah, blah, blah. And then it's been a year. And at that point, maybe you have something you can publish, but it might not. So I think that we as a collective, design research, we have to start bringing these conversations and these questions, so we can create a system in which we evaluate the things that we do in a different way.
The value is recognized not
Exactly.
necessarily in in the same manner because it's fundamentally different. So, I mean, I think this qualifies as a challenge, but what other challenges and opportunities in design research in general? Like working with people from other areas do you see here? Do you have like
Yes,
collaboration?
I was just thinking about that, and we were having that conversation prior, like I've been chatting with different scholars, and the fact that we produce a lot for ourselves, and for the question of like, what is design research? How do we present design research? And I think that there's a new path of like, and I had that several months ago. I was having a conversation with, I was dean of my school in Colombia 2 years ago, and I was having a conversation with the dean of science and the dean of engineering, and somebody presented something like an idea for something that they wanted to do. So they were like, yeah, it's fine, and I went all this way decoding the whole thing, and they were like surprised that there was some knowledge that they couldn't see on that. And I think that we have to do that more often. We have to get involved with people to challenge the way we think, but also to make sure that people from different disciplines, they understand that stuff that we do matters in a different way. And I think that it's a both ways conversation of like learning from them, challenge what we say, but also making sure that they also participate in a conversation that might be valuable.
Design can be more or less at the same level.
Yeah.
To do things differently. You mentioned like creating our own tools, and I think you were referring to like the definition, the disciplinary definition, but also one of the things in my case that I try to convey to students is that they shouldn't treat certain parts of the design process as a checklist, because what they're actually doing is not things that should be done for the sake of them, because in every design situation, what you're actually building is the tools that are going to allow you to build that whatever thing it is that you're doing.
Sure.
And I think this is something that it's often misunderstood. We have certain outputs, intermediary outputs, and I think there's a whole epistemological discussion to have about that. But I think other disciplines and other fields don't have this kind of obstacle where they can simply repurpose existing things, the way that knowledge is understood and mounted, but because of the necessary difference of the particularities of any situation. I'm not saying that you cannot repurpose things, but still you have to create elements that allow you to develop that possible situation. Can you highlight any emergent, just to finish now, topics in the area to inspire emerging researchers? This is, imagine that you were talking to someone who's just starting their journey in design research, like PhD students. Anything?
Yeah, I think that there's a space that we have to open. Well, there's different spaces that are emerging on relation with different disciplines. So design and science, design and health, design and behavior. And those are spaces that are interesting, that you can populate, that you can do research on. And that research has to be a collaborative effort with people from different disciplines. So it has to be integrating that knowledge into an idea, into producing. This is something that it's a double-sided sword. It's like we have to produce methods. We have to feel comfortable producing frameworks and methods and processes, but we have to understand that we cannot become slaves of those methods. We cannot just see the method as the tool, as you were saying, is that people get like so comfortable with the methods, and they say like, I produce this and this and this and this, so I follow the path and I got the result. And they say this is truth. It's a reality because they just follow the method. And I think that design, it's not about a certainty, it's about a decision. It's about decision making. It's not about a certainty of something that is true, like a true solution.
Yeah, it's not math.
It's not. And the other area that I see that there's a lot of growth possibilities is like in participatory processes, where we constantly learn about how people see the world, and we can incorporate those views. And I think that the beauty of participatory design is that you go outside your area of comfort, and you talk to people and you have to integrate their knowledge into what you're doing. So if you're working with indigenous communities, you have to integrate what they do. And we have seen a lot of that in this conference, of people saying like, okay, so the way people live is something that we can incorporate and discuss. Should we go slower instead of faster? Should we be more careful instead of being more productive? So I think that by relating with people and working with people, I think that design, because design is about like, it's a human condition. It's a human action. So I think that by going back into humans and saying like, okay, so how do we think about the world as it emerges and as it unfolds? And if you ask that question, then you get like different answers, right? So, oh, this is a way in which we consider creating something new or defining that future through this. And then you can incorporate that as a way of thinking inside your process. So I think that those are areas that I found interesting.
Okay, one last question, and just kind of like a pet preoccupation of mine.
A matter of concern.
A matter of concern. Do you think that monolingualism, I mean, in Europe it's not that common. Usually people speak more than one languages. But do you think that in the world of design, given that it's so Anglophone, do you think that the fact that a lot of researchers, thinkers from design are monolinguists, usually from the United States, Britain, kind of hinders them from furthering or getting more engaged or perhaps sometimes understanding the benefits of co-designing? I'm saying this because being able to speak other languages allows you and opens a lot of possibilities, and it's kind of like a possibility and a normalcy that you have to engage or look at the world in a different way. Do you think that could be? This is just a
so let me
speculation.
no. I think that's a really good question. A couple of years ago, I was in a conference. I'm not going to give names, but I was with a senior researcher, American researcher, and he commented how doing design research is already something so complicated, like, you know, working with agencies and fundings and grants and stuff like that. And then he did this little comment and then the university gives you a research assistant, an RA, who barely speaks the language and cannot like fully write something in English, right? And I was like a little like turned inside, and I raised my hand and I said like, I'm so sorry, but you're speaking about someone who's learning to build knowledge in a different, not only in a different language, but in a different way of thinking and structuring knowledge. And I think that language, it's something that reflects a lot of like worldviews of how you see the world, how you think about the world. I mean, you coming from Latin America, me coming from Latin America, there are words that we use that are not Spanish, that are either Nahuatl or Muisca or different languages that meant something different, that we have translated into words in Spanish, but they mean something different. They mean different ways of seeing the world. I think that language, it's a bridge that allows us to communicate, but it's also a barrier, because as soon as we change that, first, there's a handicap in that process. That is like, you know, for someone, and we used to discuss that with a colleague, when we started like writing papers in English, we felt like our IQ was like lower because we didn't have the resources, like the language, the tools to actually express what we wanted. But then the other thing is that either English or Spanish or Portuguese or Nahuatl or Muisca would not truly express everything. So sometimes you need that hybridation of the language that is necessary to express different things in different ways. And I think that it's important that we give the actual sense of the word to the word. So what it means and what it means as a society to say hug you or to say apapachar you, that is a different thing. It means it's not your body, it's your soul who is doing something. And that's a deep, profound way, different way of seeing things. So I think that yes, and I would just I just write a paper with a colleague about typography, language, and colonialism that we presented in ISDR. And it's just it's a conversation about that.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Juan. It was a pleasure talking to you, and hopefully everyone will enjoy the podcast. And
thank you so much
please
for
share
having
that
me here.
paper with us. Thank you.
Sure. Goodbye.
If you like what you heard today, please subscribe to our podcast on the main platform. For more information about the Unreleased podcast, go to unreleased.unidcom-IADE.pt. There, you can find all the episodes and more information about our guests. Unreleased podcast is the result of the work of the students of Design Culture and Practices course from the PhD in Design program of IADE, Universidade Europeia. It's produced and edited by UNIDCOM.